What happens when the person who hurt you changes? Like, actually changes. Not when they say they've changed, not when they apologize because they got hurt, not when they promise they'll never do it again and then do the same exact thing 3 weeks later. I'm talking about when you can genuinely look at someone and say, they're different. They're showing up differently, they're communicating differently, they're making better choices. Maybe they got sober. Maybe they went to therapy. Maybe they finally took accountability. Maybe they're treating you with the love and care you spent years begging them for. Maybe enough time has passed that everyone around you has decided the situation is over. And maybe they're not even asking you to forget anymore. But for some reason, you're still hurt. And that's confusing as hell because there's this weird guilt that comes with being hurt by someone who isn't currently hurting you. You start wondering things like, am I holding a grudge? Am I being unfair? Am I living in the past? If they've changed, shouldn't I be able to move on? How long am I allowed to be affected by something that isn't happening anymore? And maybe the hardest question, if I forgive somebody, do I owe them access to me again? So today I want to talk about the part of healing that I do not think we talk about enough. What happens when somebody changes, but what happened to you doesn't disappear? What happens when you love the person standing in front of you, but your body remembers the person that they used to be? What happens when someone becomes safer, but you still don't feel safe? What happens when your boundary remains the same, even though the person on the other side of it doesn't? Because sometimes people change. Sometimes relationships change, sometimes reconciliation is possible, and sometimes someone can become an entirely different person and you can still decide they do not get access to you. Both can be true. So let's talk about it. Hey y'all, welcome back to Between Sessions, the conversations you are already having in your head at 2 o'clock in the morning. I'm your host, Tiffany, and today we are getting into a heavy one because I've been thinking a lot lately about forgiveness, change, boundaries, trust, and what we actually owe people after they've hurt us. And I think that sometimes we talk about healing in these really clean little Instagram quote ways, like forgive and move on, protect your peace, people never change. Once someone shows you who they are, believe them. Don't let someone's past define them. And honestly, individually, there might be truth in all of those things, but real life is not that clean, y'all, because sometimes people do change and sometimes you still don't want them in your life. Sometimes people change and you desperately do want them in your life, but you don't know how to stop being afraid of them becoming who they used to be. Sometimes you forgive someone and still don't trust them. Sometimes you trust them again, but you still get triggered. Sometimes you love someone deeply and still have boundaries with them. Sometimes you can understand exactly why someone behaved the way that they did and still believe that what they did to you was unacceptable. And sometimes I believe the healthiest thing that you can do is stop forcing yourself to choose between they're a terrible person and what they did to me wasn't that bad. There's another option. You can say, I believe that you've changed, and I also believe what happened to me mattered. Those statements do not cancel each other out, and I think that's where I want to start. Change does not rewrite history. One of the strangest things about watching someone change is eventually the version of them who hurt you may not even exist anymore. And that is beautiful, seriously. I believe people deserve the opportunity to grow, and I wholeheartedly believe that. I don't want to live in a world where the worst thing someone has ever done becomes the only thing that they're ever allowed to be, because if that's true for everybody else, that's true for me too. And I know that personally, I don't want to be permanently defined by the worst seasons of my life. I want grace. I want people to recognize my growth. I want the opportunity to become better than the choices I've made in the past. So yes, people change, but here is where we really get confused. The person changing doesn't travel backwards in time and change what happened to you. Those are two completely separate processes. Their healing happens over there and your healing happens over here. And sometimes subconsciously we believe that if they've done enough work, we're supposed to be done with ours. But That's just not how trauma works. It's not even how betrayal works, and it's not how grief works. Like, sit with me for a second, okay, in this thought. Imagine somebody breaks your leg, and afterward, they feel absolutely terrible. They apologize, they take responsibility, they drive you to every single doctor's appointment, they pay all of your medical bills. They genuinely become the most careful person you have ever met. That's great. They've changed. Your leg is still broken. Their remorse doesn't remove your cast. Their accountability doesn't eliminate physical therapy. Their growth doesn't determine how quickly your body heals, and emotional injuries aren't that different. Sometimes the person who caused the wound has to move on from the version of themselves that caused it, while you're still learning how to walk on what they broke. And that doesn't necessarily mean that you're bitter. It doesn't necessarily mean that you haven't forgiven them. It means that impact and intention are different things. And I think that we honestly understand that concept intellectually, but emotionally, that's harder. Especially when the person who hurt you is now good to you, because then guilt enters the room. They're loving me, they're trying, they're showing up, they're doing everything differently. So why can't I just let this go? And honestly, sometimes we start shaming ourselves for having a nervous system that remembers something our conscious mind has decided to forgive. But your body doesn't keep a calendar. Your nervous system doesn't just wake up one day and say, oh, okay, that happened years ago. Statute of limitations is up. We're good. Sometimes something happens today that looks just enough like something happened before, and suddenly you're right back there. Not because the situation now is necessarily dangerous, but because your mind learned, last time I saw this pattern, something painful happened next. And it's its job to protect you, not to be fair, not to be rational, not to give someone credit for personal development. Its job is to recognize patterns and keep you alive. So if you've ever thought, why am I reacting to this? They're not even doing anything wrong. That might be the question. Not what's wrong with me, but what does this actually remind me of? And that's a completely different conversation. Sometimes the past triggers the present. And this is where relationships after betrayal get really complicated, because someone can be showing up beautifully in the present and something tiny can happen. Their phone goes off, their tone changes, they're taking longer than normal to respond, they get quiet, they say something that sounds familiar to something they used to say. And logically, you know this isn't necessarily anything, but emotionally, your body is already 10 steps ahead. And because your brain doesn't just remember what happened, it remembers what happened right before it happened. That's important. We talk about triggers like they're these huge, obvious things, and they're often not. Sometimes the trigger isn't the betrayal itself, it's the behavior you learned later happened right before the betrayal. Sometimes it's silence, sometimes it's somebody turning their phone over, sometimes it's a particular phrase, sometimes it's somebody being late, sometimes it's a change in affection, sometimes it's a smell, sometimes it's a location, sometimes it's absolutely nothing that another person would even notice. And that's why healing after betrayal can be so incredibly frustrating for both people. The person who changed is thinking, but I'm not doing anything wrong. And the person who is hurt is thinking, I know, but I've seen this movie before and I'm terrified I know how it ends. Neither experience automatically makes someone the villain, but what happens next matters, y'all, because if the person who caused the original hurt responds to the trigger with, here we go again, you're never going to let this go, I already apologize, why are we still talking about this? Then the wound gets another layer, because now you're not only carrying what happened, you're carrying the belief that you're not allowed to talk about what happened. And that creates emotional loneliness inside the relationship. You start editing yourself, you start filtering, you think something, and then you immediately think, don't say it. Don't ruin tonight. Don't make them defensive. Don't start an argument. Don't push them away. And eventually you have a relationship where everything looks peaceful because one person learned to stay quiet. And that's not peace, that's avoidance. And this is where I think curiosity can literally change everything. Because imagine, instead of, why are you still worried about this? Somebody says, what about this situation made you feel like you were back there? Imagine, I know I'm not doing anything of what I did before, but I can understand why this reminded you of it. Imagine, you don't have to convince me that your hurt makes sense. That doesn't mean that the other person has to spend the rest of their life apologizing. It doesn't mean that every fear automatically becomes accurate. It doesn't mean one partner gets unlimited permission to accuse, investigate, control, and punish. Healing still requires responsibility from both parties. And reassurance and accountability are not punishments, sometimes they're part of the repair. Forgiveness is not amnesia. I think that we have completely confused forgiveness with forgetting, especially if you grew up around messages about being the bigger person. Things like forgive, give grace, don't hold grudges, everyone makes mistakes. And I believe in grace. I believe people deserve room to become different, but I don't believe forgiveness requires you to pretend like you weren't harmed. And I definitely do not believe that forgiveness automatically requires reconciliation, because these are all different things. Forgiveness is about what I carry, reconciliation is about what we rebuild. Trust is about what you consistently demonstrate. Access is about what I choose to allow. Those are four different decisions. And I think we get ourselves in trouble when we treat them like they're one decision. You can forgive somebody and love them from a distance. You can forgive somebody and decide to rebuild. You can forgive somebody and still need boundaries. You can forgive somebody and realize, I genuinely hope you have a beautiful life. I just don't want to be a part of it. And that's not necessarily hatred. Sometimes that's acceptance. And sometimes we need to understand that because there are people in our lives who believe their apology creates an obligation for reconciliation, it doesn't. An apology is not an invoice. You don't owe somebody access because they finally acknowledged what they did. And their change behavior does not purchase a relationship with you either. Change is something that they should do because becoming healthier is good for them, not because it guarantees that they get everybody back that they've hurt. That's one of the consequences nobody likes talking about. You can genuinely change and still lose people because of who you were before you changed. That's painful. It's also so real. And accepting that is actually part of the accountability. Your boundary is not a punishment. Let's talk about boundaries for a minute because we misuse this word constantly. A boundary isn't you're not allowed to do this anymore. A boundary is if this happens, this is what I will do to protect myself. And boundaries aren't supposed to control somebody else's behavior, they're supposed to define your participation. That's a huge difference. And sometimes the people around you will interpret your boundary as punishment because they don't like the consequences of it. But somebody being uncomfortable with your boundary does not automatically mean that your boundary is cruel. You can say, I don't want contact. I won't discuss this person. I won't be around someone when they're drinking. I won't participate in conversations where I'm being yelled at. I won't continue a relationship without honesty. I need time. I love you, but I'm not willing to do this anymore. Those are boundaries. And here's something that I've really had to sit with. The purpose of my boundary is not to teach you a lesson. It isn't. I'm going to stay away until you finally understand what you did, because honestly, if that's the goal, I'm still emotionally waiting on you. The boundary becomes dependent on your response. A healthier boundary sounds more like I've decided what I need regardless of whether you ever understand it. That is hard because sometimes we desperately want the other person to understand. We want them to finally say, oh my gosh, I get it now. We want the perfect apology. We want acknowledgement. We want justice. We want the person who hurt us to understand the exact depth of what they did. And sometimes they will, sometimes they won't. But your healing cannot require someone else's comprehension because then they still control it. And this is especially difficult with family because family comes with this unspoken idea that blood creates permanent access. That's still your mom. That's still your dad. That's still your brother. That's still your sister. That's still your uncle. Okay, and that title tells me how we're related. It does not tell me what I am required to tolerate. Being family can explain why a decision is painful. It does not automatically determine what the decision has to be. But they're different now. This is where things get especially complicated because what if they actually are? What if someone who used to be destructive gets sober? What if someone who used to be volatile becomes stable? What if someone who hurt people goes to therapy? What if years pass? What if everybody tells you they're doing so much better? And you believe them. You might genuinely be happy for them. You might pray that their life continues to be better. You might be proud of the work that they've done. And you can still say, my boundary remains. And that's one of the hardest truths that I have had to learn. Their change does not automatically require a change in my boundary because my boundary is not necessarily judgment of who they are today. Sometimes it's a response to what the relationship has already cost me. And that's so important because there's this assumption that keeping a boundary means that you're saying you're still a bad person. Not necessarily. Sometimes you're saying, I believe that you're different. I'm still not willing to reopen this relationship. Like, sit with me again for a second, y'all, okay? Stick with me. Imagine somebody burns your house down. Years later, they become a firefighter. That is incredible growth, and you can celebrate a firefighter. You still do not have to hand them matches inside of your new home. And that's not because you believe that they're secretly waiting to burn it down again. It's because trust and access are not owed simply because risk has decreased. Sometimes peace comes from closing the door, and you don't have to reopen it just to prove that you've healed. I actually want to say that again, okay? You do not have to reopen a door just to prove that you aren't bitter about closing it. That one matters because sometimes people will use your boundary as evidence that you're not over it. And maybe I am over it. Maybe being over it is exactly why I stopped negotiating that boundary. Maybe I don't spend my days angry. Maybe I don't obsess about what happened. Maybe I don't wish anything bad on you. Maybe I've forgiven you. Maybe I have healed tremendously. And maybe the healed version of me still does not want this relationship. Healing doesn't always lead back to reconciliation. Sometimes healing leads to acceptance. But sometimes you do want to rebuild. Now, I really want to talk about the other side because I don't want this entire episode to become everyone who's hurt you should be cut off. I don't believe that either at all. Sometimes somebody does change and you want them back. Sometimes you love them. Sometimes you see their growth. Sometimes the relationship matters enough that you want to see whether something new can be built. And that can be terrifying because now the boundary isn't necessarily you can't be in my life. It might be you can be in my life, but I need certain things in order to feel safe here. And I think this is where people confuse boundaries with punishment too. Let's say trust was broken in a romantic relationship, okay? Rebuilding might require transparency, more communication, more reassurance, more patience, more difficult conversations, and that isn't necessarily controlling. The question is whether the things you're asking for are designed to create safety or designed to make the other person suffer for what they did. Those are different. There is a difference between I need honesty and consistency to rebuild and you hurt me, so now I get to control everything you do. There's also a difference between this situation triggered something in me and I need reassurance, and you need to spend the rest of your life proving your innocence. There's also a difference between somebody setting healthy limits around repeated accusation and somebody using stop living in the past to avoid accountability. This stuff is nuanced, and this is honestly why I get so frustrated with the internet relationship advice sometimes because everybody wants one sentence. Leave, forgive, once a cheater, always a cheater. If they wanted to, they would. Trust your gut. Real human beings don't fit neatly into these statements, y'all. Sometimes someone betrays you and becomes an incredible partner. Sometimes somebody apologizes beautifully and changes absolutely nothing. Sometimes your gut is intuition. Sometimes your gut is trauma. Sometimes leaving is the healthiest decision. Sometimes staying and rebuilding is. You have to look at the pattern, not the quote. Intuition versus a nervous system that remembers. This could honestly be an entire episode by itself, but I want to touch on it here because it's so connected. How do you know whether something is wrong or whether something reminds you of something that was wrong? Because those feel almost identical. Your stomach drops, your chest tightens, your thoughts start racing, you start connecting dots, and suddenly you have the whole story. Something is happening. And maybe it is, but maybe your nervous system recognized one familiar detail and sounded the alarm. This is where healing requires us to become curious about ourselves too, not dismissive, curious. Instead of immediately saying, my gut is never wrong, ask, what information do I actually have? What am I assuming? What happened immediately before I started feeling unsafe? Does the situation resemble something from my past? Is there a current pattern or am I reacting to an old one? And one of my favorites that I often ask myself a lot, if I had never experienced the original betrayal, how would I interpret what's happening right now? And that question does not automatically mean that your fear is irrational. Sometimes you ask it and realize, nope, this would concern me regardless. Okay, pay attention to that. Okay. Sometimes you realize, though, if I didn't have the history, this probably wouldn't mean anything to me. And now you have information. It doesn't mean stop feeling it. Feelings aren't court testimonies, okay? You don't have to prove their case before they're allowed to exist. But feelings also aren't always facts. They are information though. And sometimes the information isn't the person is currently unsafe. Sometimes the information is there is still a part of me that doesn't completely believe I'm safe. And that's something you can work with. The person who hurt you can help heal the relationship, but they cannot heal you for you. And this is another place where I think we swing too far in either direction. Some people say you have to heal yourself, your triggers are your responsibility. And technically, yes. But in relationships, we affect each other. If I broke trust with you, I don't get to say that's your trauma, figure it out. No, I participated in creating the wound. And if I want the relationship, I have a responsibility to participate in the repair. But on the other side, I can't make another person responsible for regulating every fear that I have forever. Eventually, I have to learn to say, I'm triggered right now. Let me figure out what belongs to the present and what belongs to the past. The healthiest version of repair probably lives somewhere in the middle. I say, something came up for me. And instead of you feeling automatically accused, you become curious. And instead of me treating my fear as proof of your guilt, I become curious too. Now it's not me versus you, it's us versus the wound. And that's completely different. Because if the relationship survived betrayal, the goal shouldn't be to determine whose emotions are more justified. The goal should be, how do we build something where this happens less often and feels safer when it does? And sometimes that means the person who hurt you needs to hear about the truth more than once. I'm sorry, okay? I know it's uncomfortable, but apologies don't automatically finish conversations. Sometimes understanding unfolds in layers. You might explain something 6 months later that you didn't even understand yourself when it happened. You might realize years later, oh, that's why this hurt me so much, or that's what hurt me so much. Healing is so weird like that. Sometimes the event happens first and the understanding comes way later. Sometimes the deepest wound isn't what you thought it was. This one is huge because sometimes we think we're hurt because someone lied. But then later we realize it wasn't only the lie, it was that I questioned my own reality. It was that I knew something was wrong and I was told nothing was wrong. It was I didn't have all the information I needed to make a choice for myself. It was that I felt stupid afterwards. It was that I felt replaceable. It was that I felt unsafe. It was that I lost trust in myself. And that's why somebody saying, I already apologize for lying, may not completely reach the wound, because you're not only healing from the lie, you're healing from what the lie meant to you. And that's why curiosity matters. Sometimes instead of asking, why can't you let go of what I did? The better question is, what did what I did make you believe about yourself? Whew. Because now we're somewhere completely different, y'all. Maybe it made you believe I'm not enough. People always leave. I can't trust anybody. I'm stupid for believing people. Love isn't safe. I have to watch everything. If I relax, I'll get blindsided. I have to keep one foot out the door so I'm never completely destroyed again. And if that's the wound, the healing is not simply they stop doing the behavior. The healing is rebuilding the beliefs that the behavior destroyed. And that's why someone can be wonderful today and then you can still struggle. You're not necessarily responding to what they are today. You're trying to undo what yesterday taught you about love. Keeping one foot out the door. I think a lot of us do this without realizing it. We say we're committed, we're in love, we're building something, we're making plans, but internally, there is one foot planted firmly inside the relationship and the other one is right by the exit, just in case. Because if I don't give you all of me, you can't destroy all of me. If I expect you to leave, maybe it won't hurt as badly when you do. If I look for the betrayal before it happens, maybe I won't feel stupid this time. If I never completely relax, maybe I can protect myself. And that makes sense. It does. But eventually, we have to ask ourselves, is the protection that saved me before preventing me from experience what I have now? And there's really not a universal answer, okay? Sometimes the answer is no. My hesitation is telling me this still isn't safe. And listen to that. But sometimes the answer is yes. This person is showing me something different, and I'm struggling to allow today's version of them to exist separately from yesterday's. That's where healing is scary because healing isn't always leaving. Sometimes healing is staying without constantly preparing to leave. Sometimes healing is allowing yourself to trust again. And trusting again after someone has hurt you isn't weakness. It isn't stupidity, it's a risk. And if you're going to take that risk, it should be supported by evidence, not promises, patterns, consistency, accountability, curiosity, honesty, behavior over time. And that's how trust comes back. Not because somebody says you should trust me, but because eventually your nervous system collects enough new evidence to say maybe this is different. Boundaries can change, but they don't have to. I want to come back to boundaries because personally, this is probably the piece that I have been sitting with lately the most. Sometimes boundaries are permanent and sometimes they aren't. And I think we put so much pressure on ourselves to know which one it is immediately. And you don't. A boundary can be this is what I need right now. And later it can be reassessed or not. Changing a boundary doesn't mean that the original boundary was dramatic. Keeping a boundary doesn't mean that you're refusing to heal. You're allowed to reevaluate based on new information. You're allowed to decide that I see the new information and my answer is still no. That's your right. Some relationships can survive transformation and some can't. And sometimes we grieve the relationship we wish we could have with somebody more than the relationship we actually had. And that is so hard with family because maybe you don't just miss the person, you miss the idea, the holidays, the memories, the version of them from childhood, the relationship before everything happened, the relationship you hope you would eventually have. And grief can make us question boundaries. You start thinking, maybe enough time has passed. Maybe I should just let it go. Maybe I'm being harsh. And maybe you genuinely do want reconciliation, and that's okay. But don't mistake missing someone for evidence that the relationship is safe. Don't mistake guilt for guidance. Don't mistake family pressure for your own desire. And don't mistake somebody else's healing journey for an obligation to participate in it. You can wish them well without walking beside them. You are allowed to hold two truths. This might be the entire episode in one sentence. Two things can be true at the same time. Someone could have hurt you deeply and still have good qualities. Someone can love you and still hurt you. Someone can change and you can still need distance. Someone can change and you can choose to rebuild. You can forgive and still remember. You can have compassion for why someone became who they became and still hold them accountable for what they did with it. You can understand addiction and still acknowledge the damage someone's addiction caused. You can understand trauma and still say their trauma did not give them permission to traumatize you. You can love your family and refuse access to certain family members. You can love your partner and still be angry about what happened. You can recognize someone's progress and still acknowledge your pain. You can be proud of someone from very far away. And I think adulthood is largely learning to tolerate the discomfort of two truths existing at the same time, because black and white thinking feels safer. If they're bad, I can leave. If they're good, I have to forgive everything. But humans are not that simple. Sometimes somebody who did something horrible is capable of becoming a healthier human being. And sometimes somebody who becomes healthier still doesn't belong in your life. And that doesn't make their change fake. And it doesn't make your boundary wrong. When other people want you to move on, something else happens when enough time passes. Other people get tired of your boundary before you do, especially family, because your boundary can inconvenience the system, right? Now somebody has to figure out holidays, somebody has to decide who's invited, people feel awkward, people don't want to pick sides, and eventually somebody says, can't everybody just move on? But notice what that often means. It means, can the person who was hurt become comfortable enough that everybody else doesn't have to be uncomfortable anymore? And no, that is not your job. You're not required to sacrifice your own emotional safety so that Thanksgiving isn't less awkward. You're not required to pretend something didn't happen because acknowledging it makes other people uncomfortable. And you don't have to continuously present evidence for why your boundary is justified. You can stop arguing your case. You can stop giving closing arguments. You can stop trying to get 12 imaginary juries to agree that what happened was bad enough. Because sometimes we get stuck explaining boundaries because deep down we still believe that we need permission to have them. And honey, you do not. And this is something that I personally have to remind myself too. A boundary does not require unanimous approval to be valid. People are allowed to disagree with it, and you are allowed to keep it. How do you know whether to reconcile? I honestly wish I could give you a checklist. I really do, but there isn't one answer. I think there are questions, though, a lot of questions. Has the person changed because they genuinely wanted to change or only because they wanted access back? Can they talk about what happened without immediately centering their shame? Can they hear your experience without correcting it? Can they tolerate the fact that your memory of what happened might be different from theirs? Do they respect your boundary even when they don't like it? Do they believe their apology entitles them to forgiveness? Do they believe forgiveness entitles them to reconciliation? Do they rush your healing? Are they consistent when nobody is rewarding them? And maybe most importantly, who do you become around them? Do you become smaller, hypervigilant, anxious, silent? Do you feel like you have to manage them, or can you be honest? Can you disagree? Can you say no? Can you bring up something uncomfortable without fearing that the entire relationship will disappear? Can you be fully yourself? Because sometimes we're so focused on have they changed that we forget to ask, how does this relationship affect me now? That's the question. Not whether they're objectively good, not whether everybody else likes them, not whether they've apologized enough, not whether they've suffered enough, not whether they've changed enough. What happens inside you when you participate in this relationship? And what do you need? You don't have to make a permanent decision today, okay? If you are listening to this because you're currently wrestling with somebody who hurt you, I want to give you permission to not know yet. You don't have to decide today whether you will ever speak to them again. You don't have to decide whether your relationship will last forever. You don't have to decide whether you completely forgive them. You don't have to force yourself to reconciliation because you're afraid you'll regret the time you lost. And you don't have to permanently cut somebody off because you're afraid of changing your mind and it will make you look weak. You can make the healthiest decision available to you today. Then you can make another decision later. Healing is not a contract. You are allowed to gather information. You're allowed to watch behavior. You're allowed to take your time, and you're allowed to change your mind at any time. What healing actually looks like. I think we imagine healing as reaching a point where something doesn't hurt anymore. And sometimes that does happen, But sometimes healing looks different. Sometimes healing is remembering without becoming consumed. Sometimes it's hearing someone's name without your entire body changing. Sometimes it's being triggered and recognizing it before you react. Sometimes it's asking for reassurance instead of starting a fight. Sometimes it's realizing I'm scared right now, but I'm not actually in danger. Sometimes it's saying no without writing a 3 paragraph explanation. Guilty. Sometimes it's allowing someone to love you differently than they did before. Sometimes it's walking away. Sometimes it's staying. Sometimes it's coming back. Sometimes it's grieving the relationship without reopening it. And sometimes it's being able to say, I love you, and my answer is still no. And sometimes healing is finally understanding I don't need you to become a bad person for my boundary to be valid. That's big because sometimes people sometimes we all keep people frozen as villains because we think if we acknowledge their growth, we'll lose the right to be hurt. And you won't. You can say to yourself and to everybody else, they're doing really well, and I don't want a relationship with them. You can say, my partner is showing up for me beautifully now, and I'm still healing from what happened before. You can say, I forgive you, and this changed something permanently. You do not have to choose. To the person who changed, and I want to speak for a minute to the person on the other side, okay? Maybe you're listening to this and you're thinking, I'm the one who hurt somebody. I've changed, I'm trying, and they still don't trust me. That hurts too. And it probably feels defeating to become someone different and still be seen through the lens of who you used to be. And I have compassion for that, okay? But if you have genuinely changed, part of your growth may be accepting that you don't control the timeline of someone else's healing. You don't get to say, I did the work, so now you have to trust me. You don't get to say, I apologize, so now you have to stop hurting. And you don't get to demand access to somebody as proof that your growth mattered. Your growth matters because you matter. Keep growing, even if they never come back. And if they do stay, be curious. If they say something scared me today, try not to immediately hear you're a terrible person. Maybe they're not saying that. Maybe they're saying there's still a part of me that's scared of losing what we have. And if you love them, maybe you can sit with that. Not forever, not without boundaries of your own, but long enough to understand because sometimes accountability sounds less like, I already said I'm sorry, and more like, tell me what part still hurts. And to the person who's still hurt, if you're the one who got hurt, you have work to do too. You cannot make someone serve a life sentence for a crime you've already decided to forgive. If you chose to rebuild, eventually you have to participate in the rebuilding. You have to learn the difference between asking for reassurance and demanding proof. You have to learn the difference between a trigger and evidence. You have to learn when the past is informing you and when it's controlling you. You have to stop secretly testing people. Stop setting traps. Stop expecting them to read your mind. Stop collecting evidence for a conclusion that you already decide is true. And when you're afraid, say you're afraid. There is so much power in replacing what the F are you doing with something about this made me feel unsafe and I'm trying to understand why. That is vulnerability. And vulnerability after betrayal is terrifying because anger feels safer. Anger puts armor on, fear takes it off. But if you're trying to create intimacy again, eventually the armor has to come off sometimes. Not because they deserve unlimited access to you, but because you deserve the chance to experience love without constantly preparing for war. The boundary is for you. I want to leave y'all with one of the biggest realizations that I had. Your boundary isn't about determining whether somebody deserves punishment. It's about determining what you need to live peacefully. And those are completely different questions because when you ask, do they deserve another chance? We can argue forever. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But ask instead, do I want to participate in this relationship? That's something you can actually answer. You don't need a diagnosis. You don't need everyone else to agree. You don't need to prove they're a narcissist. You don't need to prove they're toxic. You don't need a courtroom. You don't need a unanimous family vote. You don't need them to currently be doing something wrong. Sometimes this relationship is not healthy for me, is enough. And on the other side, you don't have to leave someone you genuinely believe changed simply because the internet tells you that staying means you don't respect yourself. You get to decide that too. Your healing is yours. Your relationship is yours. Your boundaries are yours. And you are allowed to make nuanced decisions about complicated people. So they've changed, but why are we still hurt? Because their change and your healing was never the same process. Maybe they changed in 6 months. Maybe your body needs 2 years to believe it. Maybe they become the person you always hope they would become. And unfortunately, too much happened for you to want a relationship with them anymore. Maybe they become the person and you're slowly learning how to love them again. Maybe you're still figuring it out. There isn't one correct ending, but I think the goal is to reach a place where you're not making decisions from guilt. Not they're doing better, I should let them back in. Not they hurt me once, so I'm never allowed to trust them again. Not my family thinks I should forgive. Not everybody online says I should leave. But what is true for me? What am I seeing? What am I feeling? What has their behavior demonstrated? What does my body remember? What belongs to yesterday and what is happening today? And what boundary allows me to honor both? Because somebody else's transformation doesn't invalidate your trauma. Their apology doesn't erase the impact. Their sobriety doesn't erase what happened while they were using. Their therapy doesn't erase what happened before therapy. Their consistency today doesn't erase yesterday's betrayal. But yesterday's behavior doesn't always have to erase today's growth either. Both can be true. They changed and you're still hurt. You forgive them and you still need a boundary. You love them and you're still afraid. You see who they are today and still remember who they were. You can hold all of that. You don't have to rush yourself into choosing one truth just because holding two feels uncomfortable. Maybe that's part of healing too. Not rewriting a story, not pretending the bad parts didn't happen, not refusing to acknowledge the good parts happening now. Just finally being able to look at the whole story and say, all of this is true, and I still get to decide what happens next. And maybe your next step is opening the door. Maybe it's leaving it cracked. Maybe it's locking it. Maybe it's simply sitting your hand on the doorknob for a while because you're not ready to decide. Whatever it is, make sure you're doing it because it's what you need, not because someone convinced you that healing should look a certain way. Thanks so much for sitting with me, you guys. I hope you enjoyed this one. I will talk to you guys in the next one. This is Between Sessions.